Hello, I'm Dr. Louis Nagel. I'm the instructor for Jewish Education 522, Supervision in Jewish Education. Today's lesson is on observing skills. I want to start with a look at a verse from Torah. This is Moses has led the Israelites to freedom from slavery in Egypt, and the Israelites are settling down. They're getting to know how Moses does things, and Moses is sitting in judgment. The Israelites are lined up, a very long line. They're bringing him their questions on Jewish law. They want him to help settle disputes. At the end of the day, Moses' father-in-law, the original supervisor, looks at Moses, goes over to him and says, Lo tov hadavar asher ata oseh. The thing you are doing is not right. And Jethro moves on to tell Moses, look at this. You're exhausting the Israelites. They're waiting. Some of them are waiting all day to hear from you, to be able to bring their question to you. And look at you. You're spending all day. They're coming right up to you. They're asking you their questions. It's stressing you out. It's wearing you out. You can't keep this up. Well, Jethro goes on to propose to Moses a way of delegating authority. So this is the original supervisor, supervisee being told in really cold terms, lo tov, what you're doing is no good. Well, we have another verse in Torah, comes later, it's in Vayikra, and it says, you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. That's Vayikra chapter 19, verse 17. And what does that mean for us? Well, here's the supervisor-supervisee relationship. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. That teacher who you don't think is doing good things in the classroom, you can't hate them. You've got to interact with them. You've got to go to them and bring the issue, bring the challenge to them. So reprove your kin. It means going up to that person and saying, what you're doing, let's say you're missing the mark, but incur no guilt on their account because they are your responsibility. If they're miseducating children, if they're not treating children right, that's a reflection on you. So let's move into our lesson on observing skills. So what's the goal of supervision? It's improved instruction. One of the fundamental, key, essential tools of supervision is classroom observation, visiting the classroom, seeing the teacher in action. Now, observation can be informal or formal. In this talk, we're going to look at formal observations and observational instruments. Be aware, too, that there are other means of gaining a sense of a teacher's strengths and weaknesses. There is the 3-minute walkthrough, and that's not a bad way to get a sense of what's going on in a class and with the teacher. It is a long way away from clinical supervision. Other ways of gathering data. Look at the teacher's communications with parents, colleagues, and administration, their informal comments on students, the language in progress reports, student academic progress, and teacher workroom interactions with colleagues. So, observation. The yin and yang of observation is description and interpretation. It's describing what you saw and interpreting what you saw. So in this process, you need not rush into interpretation. You need to, at least in a grounding, you need to stick with description. You want to avoid the interpretation trap, wrong conclusions based on an observation. You're more likely to have agreement with a teacher on what you saw, the objectively observable. If you say, there were 4 children in your class who did not have their books open, or there were no pencils available to get started with the writing exercise. So stick to description at first. Interpretation, that can and does provoke a negative response. It brings about defensiveness, it brings about some conflict. And remember, what is the goal of supervision? It is that teachers will have adopted a mindset of ongoing improvement. That means improved teaching practice. And observations create a basis for dialogue. So they're formative observation instruments. Formative observation instruments are not summative evaluation instruments. Let me go a little further with that. So formative observation instrument, it's to find out if a practice or a technique or a process or some pedagogic experiment, as examples, are effective. You have agreement in advance on what is the focus of the observation. Like, let's see if separating these two children is effective at your classroom management, or trying a suggested class or lesson process. Like, I want you to try a 10 to 15 minute warm-up activity, then transition into a 15 minutes of direct instruction. Again, 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes. And then 10, 15 minutes of practice, and then leave toward the end, 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes for review, for closing, for bringing some closure to that lesson. So a summative evaluation instrument, those are usually externally imposed. It's the same criteria for everybody, and it's uniformly applied. It's judging all teachers on similar criteria. And the goal there is to assess, are they worthy? Do they merit being retained as teachers? And it's a statement on their competence as employees. So that's also not what we're getting into today, a summative evaluation instrument. So we want to look at ways of describing. So, and one of the things you're going to do is you're going to record your descriptions. That's what this is about. So I'll get into some of those observation methods and instruments. An observation instrument, it's a tool for organizing and recording what is observed. So some are simple and focused on a particular aspect of a lesson, questions, speakers, directions. Others are multifactorial, as would identify a variety of interrelated behaviors or details. It could be movements versus types of statements and duration of activity, which would be time-oriented, time-sensitive. It could be about all of this. You're looking to discover, to observe, and to take notes. Now, first up, I'm going to talk about quantitative observations and categorical instruments. These are performance indicator instruments, and visual diagramming would fit into this category. Second, later I'll get into qualitative observations, and this is more my strength. It's much more my passion. In my experience, that's a better fit for synagogue school education, which is not to dismiss quantitative observation. Here, you could have verbatim transcriptions. That's when you're diligently writing down what gets said. And this is also focused question observation, and a new favorite of mine, educational criticism. Then there is the opportunity for tailored observations, quantitative or qualitative observations premised on teacher or educator concerns. Quantitative observations, these measures are precise. They measure, the focus is on events, behaviors, objects, they're statistical. You choose according to your goals or objectives, and you can make it fit to the teacher. An example is categorical frequency. At intervals, you're checking off a category being measured. At mark X, at 5 minutes, at 10 minutes, at 15 minutes, you note the behavior. An example could be on-task, off-task behavior. Of course, you have to define what is on-task and off-task. Or who is speaking. You could even go a little bit multifactorial with that. Is it a boy or a girl? See if there's gender balance in the teaching. So who's talking? Is it a student? Is it the teacher's aide, or other, something like the text is in a way speaking, or an audio visual. So let me show you just a couple of vague examples of those. But first, also, some could focus on the teacher, individual students, multiple pairings or groupings, and also types of statements. So let me show you a couple of examples of what a charting might look like. So observing skills, categorical frequency, verbal interaction mapping. So the first, this is a categorical frequency chart. So here we have I sat down, I was planning on getting into this lesson at the top of the hour, let's say 10 o'clock. And I have ready at 10:05, at 10:10, at 10:15, at 10:20. I've charted that out. And here I want to look at who is speaking. So at 5 minutes, I'm going to put a little check because at 5, because it was the teacher speaking. 5 minutes later, I'm going to put a check. Happens to be the teacher was still speaking. But then at 15, I'm going to put a check. It was next to a boy student speaking. 5 minutes later, the aide was getting all attention. And going through this lesson, did media come into play? Is even going to be a check. Media in any kind, and you could even divide that out. Was it book media? Was it sound, audio recording? Was it visual media? So that's one version. And another, here we're taking the same kind of thing, this by time intervals, and now we're looking at questioning behavior, Bloom's taxonomy. So is the teacher asking level 1 questions? That's really simple, basic fact question. How many books are there of the Torah? What is the capital of Jerusalem? What is capital of Jerusalem? What is the capital of Israel? I already gave you away the answer. I've done that with students too. Or higher order questions. Along the way, explaining something, or the higher order questions, the big questions that go, that have a multitude of answers and maybe even borderline, there are no right answers. That's my favorite. But here's a charting of dialogue behavior. So I've sat down in class and I've charted that here's where the students are speaking, here's where the teacher is, and the triangle, that's me sitting in the back of the room. The arrow going back and forth, that's where the door is. To the right, that line, that is the chalkboard. And at 5 minutes into the lesson, the teacher is speaking to the class. I'm not noting what they're saying, and I could work that into this, but right now I'm just working at who is talking. 5 minutes later, the teacher's still doing the talking, but I even put in a little bit of scribbling because this kid was sort of talking over the teacher at the time. So we have 2 people talking there. 5 more minutes later, it's again, we're back to the teacher doing the talking. I'm not doing anything in here talking up the quality of the speaking. Is he asking questions? Are they statements? 5 minutes later, okay, the class has been broken into groups. Now, remember, this is an instrument for me, but I'm going to also sit down with the teacher afterwards and we're going to review this. At this point, you move the class into small groups. Then 5 minutes later, the teacher's circulating around the room. That's worth noting. And 5 minutes later again. So now we've also had 15 minutes of the kids working in small groups, which could be a good thing. Did you notice at this point that the kids were less focused on their work, that the room was getting noisier? Then we've gone back to the teacher being at the front of the room, doing the talking, the students are doing the listening, and 5 minutes later, we're still getting that. But now, again, we've had the kids broken up into pairs, and they stay working in pairs. The teacher's moving along a little bit, and now 5 minutes, and I'm talking to Mr. Cohen about his lesson. And in that last 5 minutes, you did a fine job of summing up the lesson, asking a couple of questions, because this is also a trigger for me to remember. And I might write little notes on the side too, of what's going on after noting this, going on to the end of the lesson. So, and this is the closure of the end of the lesson. So, our observations, we have also types of statements that we could be marking off in these kind of chartings: directions, questions, delivering data on the subject, a digression from the topic, answers that are on target, or maybe answers that are off target, because these are also indicators of classroom management too. So, and there's also another way of charting of a performance indicator. And this is a cluster of sought behaviors from your end, from administration, and you're looking at whether they're occurring or not. Things like a lesson plan chart. The textbook happens to make reference to the Hunter model performance indicator. And that's interesting in and of itself. There are some people who love the Hunter model and some who really think it's a terrible thing. I've gone this route, though, after doing professional development workshops where I'm setting an agenda. It could be a teaching process like that Hunter model that I want them to do. There should be that introduction to the lesson, there should be some action, and there should be some review at the end, which is Madeline Hunter-like. And it could be a content or a behavior agenda. So content, I might want teachers to integrate into their lesson midot, Jewish ethical values. So I want those things taught, but I also want them practiced in the lesson. So if I've taught them kavod, respect cherish your colleague's honor as your own, and looking at the lesson, understanding that the class either has already learned this, but may not have internalized the behavior, and say, are you showing kavod to your classmates? So there it's a content agenda integrated into a behavior agenda. Then there could be classroom management that I'm observing. I'm looking for how the teacher is managing time. Like I referred to in that chart earlier. Did they spend too much time in small groups, or did the teacher spend too much time being frontal in the lesson? I've also had creativity agendas where I wanted teachers to integrate into their lessons, maybe some music, maybe some drama, maybe some creative writing. And that's also something that I could go in, spend quantity time in a class and look and go, well, did you use the creative arts at the beginning of the lesson as a motivating activity, or did you use it toward the end as a summation of the lesson? So that's going and doing observations based on an agenda. So you could also do visual diagramming. This is a long-time favorite of mine. That was the map where you're looking at teacher behavior and who's doing the talking. So you can map the classroom. There are lots of ways of doing that. I gave you a lovely example. So now here's what's more my passion. And this is more in keeping with my research orientation, which was phenomenology, which is the ultimate in qualitative. So qualitative observation, it's sometimes called descriptive observation. It's more open-ended. You observe, you may thematize and draw conclusions that way. Thematizing, it's like looking for patterns. So there are many different approaches to qualitative observation. There is, again, verbatim. I'm writing down what was said mostly. You could use open-ended narrative. You could use a focused questionnaire. And then there is educational criticism. So in verbatim or selected verbatim, you're recording verbal interaction. You're recording everything that's said. Now the strength in this, it's a focus on the quality and the type of the interaction. A drawback is it's a lot of work before, during, and then after going through those notes. You can be selective about it. You can only record questions, or you can only record one-on-one exchanges as examples. Then there's detached, open-ended narrative. This is also, it's a lot of work. You're recording everything. You're recording time. You're recording physical space description. You're recording interactions. Then there's participant, open-ended observation. And this I do the most. So again, it's called participant, open-ended observation. Instead of you being this nebulous, objective, don't pay any attention to me, you actually in some ways become a part of the classroom. You're openly interacting and you are highly and clearly visible. It is a way of finding a lot about how the teacher is teaching and how the students are interacting and how they're understanding lessons. Then there is a focused questionnaire observation. This is another tendency of mine. Observation can be guided by just a few questions. Again, I'll do this when I'm advancing an agenda, like I've done for midot education, ethical values, ethical principles. When I've been advancing active learning, and that is student-centered learning, or that educational process that I referred to as a set induction or motivating activity at the beginning, then some content part of a lesson, and then a closure piece toward the end. So some of the things I've gone looking for too is the teacher's progression through a lesson and looking at what are the students doing. It's one of those questions I ask teachers too at the end of a lesson often. Not what did you teach? What did the students learn? Or what makes you think that they learned that? How do you know? You might also look at what behaviors or interactions or expressions of, like I referred to earlier when we're doing midot education, is what am I seeing kavod? Am I seeing dibuk chaverim? That's cleaving to friends. And you're answering these things descriptively. And then there is educational criticism. Now this is a hybrid of previous approaches. It's observation, it's description, it's interpretation. You're looking at the gestalt, you're looking at the whole of what's going on in the class. And you do need to bring experience to this approach. Now, it was advanced by Elliot Eisner, a member of the tribe, and he saw teaching as an art form. A quote from him, "Artistry, therefore, can serve as a regulative ideal for education, a vision that speaks to what really matters in schools." He goes on to say, "It may be that by shifting the paradigm of education reform and teaching from one modeled after the clock-like character of the assembly line into one that is closer to the studio or innovative science laboratory might provide us with a vision that better suits the capacities and the futures of the students we teach." So Eisner, he was into connoisseurship. He regarded teaching like a fine wine, a mix of qualities. Is it full-bodied? How's the bouquet? Is it sweet? So a way to remember Eisner in this approach, he was a professor at Stanford. That's near California wine country. And maybe that connoisseurship was a part of his inspiration. But he's also saying that there is not a one size fits all appreciation for teaching. And this is very much an approach I take, and I think Jewish educators should take. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it's good, sometimes not. I had experience working, I've had two Cheryls that were very, in many ways, unpopular in school and in many ways, very popular. Cheryl 1 was tough, pretty dogmatic, very demanding. Students knew exactly where they stood in her classes, and she was very goal-oriented. And she was a brilliant teacher, one of the best teachers, if not the best teacher, I dare say, that I've ever worked with. She had the best and the most positive impact on most of her students. And again, this is where we get into the one size fits all. That Cheryl didn't work for everybody. Cheryl 2, the same kind of thing. She brought she was a lawyer before she became a teacher. And so she had a very rigid, structured way of doing things, which was perfect for some students. There were other students that it ran against their grain, but she had an orderly class and kids knew where they stood. And at the end of the day, at the end of the month, and at the end of the year, they learned what they were supposed to learn. I have another teacher, Michael. He's also a wonderful teacher, a charming, calm gentleman. And that's his approach to teaching. He's charming, he's calm, he knows what he wants to teach, and he's very gentle with his students. And they do learn. It amazes me when we get to those marking points. I'm not talking grades, I'm talking about, can they do the Ahavta? Can they lead Aleinu? And he gets them there every time. So tailored observation systems. There's always room for creativity and hybridization once you have a sense of different approaches. And here you can create a system focused on particular agenda or focus. Sometimes there's a unique problem. There's a brilliant student, an unchallenged student. So you're looking at what's going on in the classroom, or there's a disruptive student and what is the effect on classmates. Those students are sometimes, by the way, your canary in a coal mine. So you can craft or adapt approaches to observation. So types and purposes of observation, ideally, you have a range of observational techniques that you can deploy. Experiment, find your best fit, one that gets you where you want to go. We are in a unique educational environment. We're exploring new frontiers. Generally, we have a lot of independence, and especially in this area, supervision. And does anybody do it right? I'm not really sure, and I'm even not making any claims. It's very much an experiment. So cautions concerning observations, objectivity, I think it's somewhat of a myth, so be aware of that. There are human factors that come into play. And the question is always, how will people respond to criticism? So you have to think, is this even an effective approach to improving instruction? So summary, one of the things we want to do is hold up a mirror up to the teacher. Some research says that this has an influence. I do believe in provoking reflection. In the process of reporting to the teacher, take care to distinguish description and interpretation, in which case you're well served to make the distinction clear. As I started with, the Talmud talks about rebuke, hocheach tocheach. This calls for teacher skills, it calls for people skills, it calls for communication skills, diplomacy, and tact. Dan lifnei mi ata omed, know before whom you stand. You have to know that teacher, and you have to know yourself. Remember, you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. Later in the Talmud, it says, he who rebukes another should administer the rebuke in private. Speak to the offender gently and tenderly, and point out that they are only speaking for the wrongdoer's own good. That's kind of harsh. Also in the Talmud, we get, you shall, a rephrasing or a quote coming back to, you shall surely rebuke the other. Rabbi Tarfon said, in this generation, there is no one capable of rebuking. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, in this generation, there is no one capable of receiving rebuke. Rabbi Akiva then said, in this generation, there is no one who knows how rebuke ought to be worded. Thank you very much.